Welcome to the Nokken Sports News. Today we have a special guest, Michael Russo with The Athletic. How are you doing, Michael?
I'm doing great. How are you, Isaiah?
Good. I'm glad to have you on. How was the draft, by the way?
It was good. It was, not a action-packed draft from the Minnesota Wild standpoint. Actually, really from anybody's standpoint, at least from trades and things like that point of view, there really wasn't a lot going on during the draft. But I think the Wild, did its business the way that they wanted to. They really liked Charlie Stramel a lot. And then they got a couple of really quality kids in the second round. And the big thing, I think, from a Wild fan perspective, is they got some centers. And as you know, this team, that's where they're trying to develop to figure out a way to get some quality centers into their lineup in the next 3 or 4 years. Obviously, it's going to take a couple of years for these guys to develop. And Charlie, in his case, he's going to a sophomore year in college, so it's going to be a bit. But so far so good to add to their prospect pool.
Yeah, and I noticed they picked a lot of local guys here in the draft.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, very, very different than what it used to be. The mentality of this organization, at least when I first started covering it, is that it almost was like they avoided Minnesotans. And now this draft, I mean, man, they went out and brought a bunch of people in. I think, a lot of people really excited about Jimmy Clark, seventh round pick from Medina. And then obviously getting Aaron Pionk, Neil Pionk's brother, is a pretty big one as well. Then Charlie Stramel. And so, they're starting to, they why not, right? This is the state of hockey with a ton of really quality kids that are developed here, and it just makes a lot of sense to try to go and get them.
yeah, I'm excited to see how these guys do. And, it's going to be a couple of years, but I think we'll really, benefit from them and we'll see how it goes. So, but my first question was, how did you kind of get into the business of journalism?
Yeah. Well, I started when I was in high school. I was about 15 years old. I used to announce all the games at my high school. I grew up in South Florida, and I used to announce all the baseball games and the football games and the basketball games on public address. And I befriended a lot of the local sports writers at the newspapers there in South Florida: the Sun Sentinel, Miami Herald, Palm Beach Post, Boca News. And slowly but surely started working in the offices of the Sun Sentinel and answering phone calls, talking to coaches, getting stats. And that was back when newspapers really devoted a lot of resources to covering high schools, and especially in Florida, where there's just so many great high schools and great programs down there. And and next thing I know, I started writing for the Boca News and the Sun Sentinel, and that became more of a full-time gig with the Sun Sentinel. And then eventually I became the Florida Panthers beat writer about 21 years old. So I kind of grew up around hockey. Have covered every sport. I've covered everything down there, from the Marlins, the Dolphins, obviously the Heat and the Panthers as well. University of Miami and FSU and UF. Covered soccer, covered tennis, golf, and so it's a great place to grow up in the newspaper business. And kind of, I really genuinely grew up in a newsroom. I mean, I started as a teenager, 15, all the way to now. And then I eventually in 2005 moved here and got the job at the Star Tribune covering the Wild. And I've been at the Athletic since 2017.
Yeah, so for me, I'm 17, so I'm very interested in this stuff. And with NSN, we get a lot of kids who are kind of interested in this as well. What would you kind of give them for tips or anything to go on to that next level?
Well, I think what you're doing is great. Like when I was younger, there was no such thing as podcasts and all that. And I think it doesn't even matter how many people, like if you want to get into the media business, it doesn't matter how many people you think are reading your blog or listening to your podcast. A lot of it is getting reps, just like if you were a sports, an athlete and, in your case, out on the soccer field, and just getting reps and reps and reps. And the more you learn your voice, like if you're in the podcast game or the radio or TV, the more you gather your voice, the more comfortable you feel in front of a camera and radio or podcast or whatever. It just helps you develop into feeling comfortable in those situations. And same thing with writing. A lot of people are like, well, should I start a blog? Who's reading it? Well, who cares? Watching a game on TV, then writing what you saw on the game, then maybe looking tomorrow at the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press or the Athletic and seeing how they wrote their stories compared to how you wrote yours, and just kind of practice makes perfect. I think that's a big thing. I just think, it's a lot harder to get into my business nowadays, but there's a lot more different avenues to get into the business. you know, I mean, I was just on a social media platform. The Wild just announced they're having this crazy game of hockey event this weekend, and this might be embarrassing for somebody like you, but there's this kid, Coach Chippy, that just joined
Yeah.
as like a celebrity. And I'm like,
Hmm.
who the heck is this guy? I recognized him because I've seen him all over Instagram and things like that. But I'm like, what is his story? And I Googled him, and here he's a self-made kid that's probably a gazillionaire, on TikTok, and 500,000 followers on Instagram and TikTok and all that. And so there's, there are, in other words, there's other ways to get into this business or make a name for yourself that aren't the traditional ways that you would have to do it when I was a younger person. And I just think that to me makes for kids your age, it just means the sky's the limit. And if you're creative and come up with a way to sell yourself, especially in these social media platforms where you don't need to have an employer, you could just get your own podcast out there, your own blogs, your own social media accounts to try to become an influencer like Coach Chippy or Zach Bell or some of these kids. I just think there's a lot more ways nowadays to sort of create your quote brand.
Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities, and I think just getting started for a lot of people is kind of that first step. And once you get those reps, like you were talking about, it really starts to make a difference. So
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say is also networking. Like it really is who you know. I mean, and trying to get in front of people where you could sit down and learn about their business and do things that you're doing. Asking people that if you're a young person, it's like I want to be a sports writer, trying to figure out a way to get in front of that sports writer and ask him or her advice. That's a big way as well. Is because when you get out of high school or out of college and you want to get that job at a radio station or a TV station or a podcast network or a place like the Athletic, there's just a ton of competition. So if you have that it just really, really helps. So I highly recommend young people trying to, essentially be a pest. Email sports writers or sports anchors or sports radio hosts at the Fan or whatever, and incessantly and try to say, hey, can we grab a coffee? Can we grab lunch? Can we do a podcast together? And I think that's that way. If you start to develop those relationships, even if that person is, somebody that you don't think you're going to be able to get in front of, it's not. There's no harm in trying, right?
yeah, for sure. I send out a lot of DMs to people, and if they
Yeah.
don't get answered, worst case scenario. But like for you,
Yep,
it was
and actually, that's a great example. I mean, you probably DM'd me a bunch of times, and it's just
yep.
I happened to at that moment look at it at the right time, and that's how you got in touch with me. And I think that is something that don't be shy too. If you DM somebody or email that person and they don't get back to you right away, write them again because I think a lot of times when a lot of people are busy, if you don't happen to be looking at that exact moment, next thing you know, it's just you're easily kind of getting overwritten. And I find that a lot of times in the off season, it's a lot easier to get in touch with me than during the season, because if I don't at that exact moment text somebody back or DM somebody back or email, next thing you know, it's kind of piles up and you just lose it. And so I found that today I was going and clearing out my email list, and this poor kid from high school here in Minnesota, I think she emailed me in January, and I just saw the email today and wrote her back, and I felt terrible about it, but it was just one of those things where at the moment that she emailed me, I just didn't see it. And so at least I got back to her today, and we'll see if we're able to kind of connect and sit down and have a coffee.
Yeah, hopefully that turns out. And speaking of during the season, could you like walk us through a typical day covering the Wild, let's say during the season?
Well, it's probably a lot. I don't know. Some days are easier than others. One cool thing is that so I write for the Athletic, and Joe Smith, who's my colleague here in Minnesota that covers the Wild with the Athletic, he moved here from Tampa this year, so this is the first time in my entire career that I've had sort of a partner to really split the beat with, and that has made life a lot easier on me. But on a typical day is wake up and your phone, unfortunately, in this business is attached at the hip 24/7. This can happen anytime. Doesn't matter the point in the off season, the point in the season. So that's a little stressful, is just being able to sort of decompress and not think about the team. Even if you're scrolling through Twitter, you might be on vacation, but next thing you know, people are asking questions that have you thinking about the team. So you wake up, you check your phone, make sure that you're not missing something or things like that. And then usually the way it works is that if they have a game the night before, practice is at 10:30, or usually at around 11. If they don't have a game the night before, usually practice around 10. Morning skates are around 10. So if it's a game day, it's definitely different. If it's a game day, I go down to the arena around 9:30, and then cover the morning skate, maybe write something up, then go home and get ready for the game and wind up back at the arena around 4 o'clock, 4:30 for a 7 o'clock game. If you're on the road, it's a lot different. Sometimes you're catching up to the team because they leave the night before on a charter and you're flying commercial. So if I cover a game and it's the beginning of a road trip and I don't leave the arena till maybe 1 a.m., I might have a 6 a.m. flight and have to catch up. So it sometimes gets a little bit hectic. And then, as always, it really depends on what's going on with the team. Some days are a lot easier than others. There's nothing to write about. You're inventing stories. Some day it seems like all health breaks loose and there's trades or whatever. So, I mean, that's the kind of the fun part of this business, is that you just really never know on a daily basis what you're going to be dealing with. A day like today is a lot easier. Like, I know that today they have to, a couple players, there's a deadline to file arbitration. So, all day today, I was just waiting to get that word. And then eventually I got the word and we were able to report it. But some days you don't know what's going to happen. And so you kind of always have to react or try to stay ahead of the news, cultivating your sources the best you can.
And I'm sure for you, it's a lot easier when you've done it for a couple years and you've, been through those difficult days and then those easier days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're it's definitely a lot more comfortable in your own skin than sorry, I was just coincidentally making sure I didn't miss any news there.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, like, to me, like, I've done this job for so long. I remember when I was a young sports writer, I was like nervous about everything. Like every single day you woke up and you're worried about getting scooped or you're worried about staying on top of the story. And now it does become old hat, and and there's really probably very few things that can kind of throw me. A lot of this job is relationship building and developing relationships with sources, having those type of relationships where you can call up a player and have a conversation, or and also being accountable for what you write, like a lot of, and for what you say. A lot of times if a player is pissed off at me, it's not even something that I wrote. It's something that I tweeted. It's something that I said on the podcast, said on a radio show that got back to him. And so that's where it becomes tough. But, I ask players every day in print to be accountable for their actions. If they turn a puck over, I write about it. Well, if I write something that they're not happy with, I have to stand up and be a man and be able to face that player. And so those are the toughest things, I think, for young sports writers to get used to, is just that you have to have a spine. If you write it, you have to stand up for the reason why you write it, explain yourself at times. And this job, there's a lot of times behind the scenes that fans have no idea, where you've pissed somebody off or you're putting out some sort of fire, and you're dealing that with on an everyday basis. And that to me is part of the gig.
Yeah, and that was kind of going to my next question, like how you manage the questions, and seeing the players the next day. It's kind of got to be like one of those where you got to figure out like what he's going to say the next day, or if it's going to come back at you.
Yeah, I mean, usually the one thing I try to do is be very professional. So I feel like, I don't get personal with any players when I'm writing. I don't call a play stupid or something like that. So you got to just leave it sort of what we're seeing on the ice. But in terms of regular interviewing styles, I mean, that's one thing, is my interview styles is a lot of times, I'll have like a piece of paper with a list of things on it. And but a lot of young kids, they'll actually write down their questions like verbatim what they're going to ask. And the problem with that is then you're not listening to what that person's saying. And the best type of interviews that you could have are like free flowing conversations, where it's just like you and it's like if
Yeah.
you were out with your buddies at a restaurant and you're just chatting at Green Mill or something. You want it to be like that when you're having an interview. And a lot of people that sit there and write down question after question after question, they sit there and they don't listen to what they're saying. Just can't have that back and forth conversation. And that's how you write the great personality profiles and features, if you're having a conversation. So like when I show up to practice every day, as long as I'm not trying to put out a fire from something I wrote the day before, if I got a story idea in mind, I'm sitting down with that player and I'm just got a topic of questions that I want to hit. And it's sort of, they're more things to just try to make me remember what I want to talk to that player about. And I think that's why I have good relationships with a lot of players over the years. I mean, I could probably count on maybe two hands, the amount of players I've covered over the years that absolutely despise me. But the other part of this job is that you got to realize that you're writing for the fans. My job is not to make friends with these players. My job is not to make friends with the GM, the coach, whatever. I have somebody that I really respect that years ago told me, I'd much rather be respected than liked. And I've always kept that in mind, is that like every day that I go in there, my only goal is to make sure that these guys have that there's a mutual respect there. And it's not about me trying to, become the most popular sports writer around with these guys.
Yeah, and dealing with the fans as well. I know you do a good job of the trolling on Twitter. I noticed during the Stars Wild playoff series, there's a couple people going at you. How do you kind of deal with that without kind of going too far?
Yeah,
How do you,
that's the hard. Yeah, it's hard, especially in today's day and age. I mean, social media can be so evil at times and so mean spirited, and it is tough because we're obviously all human beings, so sometimes I have a tendency to react less than professionally. But the other thing is that I was having this conversation with John Krasinski the other day, one of my colleagues at the Athletic, about this, and we were talking about how weird it is that you could get 100 people telling you great article or you're the best and all that stuff, but that one person that doesn't like the article or rips on you, that's the thing that somehow festers in our mind. I think that's probably human nature, but it is. I mean, it's one of those things where I try to ignore it, and sometimes you just can't, and you eventually react, and it gets really heated in playoff series. I don't know what it's become. It's almost like fans when Minnesota is playing a team like Dallas or whoever, and it doesn't have to be Minnesota versus Dallas, it could be any team. It's almost like the fans of that other team, they realize that if they rip on the Minnesota Wild Twitter account, well, who cares? They're not going to respond. It's also some social media young person that doesn't make a lot of money that is not going to sit there and react. You're not going after, like, if you rip on the Wild, Kirill Kaprizov's not seeing that. It's going to be
yeah.
some social media manager, where it's almost become like they just pick out a sports writer from the other side's team and they use that person as like the target to just rip on and rip on and rip on. And what fans don't realize is that I don't work for the Wild. If you sit there and trash my team like they love to think, it like it doesn't affect me. If the Wild win a cup, I'm not getting a ring. So sometimes I think fans really have trouble understanding that the sports writer of that other team does not work for the team. They just are seeing things obviously in that team's mind because that's where the fan base is that they're writing for. And so it does become tough at times. And when you're being inundated every single day with negativity after negativity after negativity on social media, it does have a way to change your mood. And then eventually, sometimes I'll react in a really poor way on Twitter, and it won't even be about that tweet I just got. It's just something that's been bothering me for freaking 24 hours, and eventually it's like, how it is. It's like if you take punch after punch after punch, eventually you're just going to erupt. And
Yeah.
so that's the one thing I'll admit, Isaiah, I don't do a great job of that. And it's something that I continue to grow. And that's why I think that all of us, not just people in the public eye like myself, I think we all kind of need to sometimes take a little bit of a break, a little vacation off social media. I was telling you before the show started that I'm going to Italy on Friday. I'm going to have to do my absolute best not to sit there and scroll Twitter during it. I think just for my own mental sanity, I got to kind of take that little refresh break and just get off social media for a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult too because a lot of people are so invested in their teams that it's just like the moment, you get scored on in OT
Yep.
or a crazy goal like that, something happens, you got to go to Twitter right away or you got to go to Instagram and comment. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now with, I would say, like my generation,
Yeah.
it's always got to be on the internet. So it's hard, but it's just kind of trying to figure out, what your brand is and how you're going to react to it.
Yep. Exactly. I think that's a good point.
So, and then also I had, because I want to keep it more wild as well. If you were Billy Guerin, how would you deal with the cap?
Well, that's tough. They made a trade the other day for Pat Maroon, and my biggest question on that one was what's the rush? Like, Maroon might be available in a couple of weeks. Maybe it would be better and more prudent to try to get Gustafson, Duham, and Addison signed, and then counts exactly how much money you have left, because I do think that it just makes the situation a lot more tighter right now. But in his mind, he needed one more forward, and he went out and got him. uh, the other day. I mean, it's just super hard, Isaiah. Like, I don't know if there's much that you can do other than starting to trade big players away. That's the only way that maybe you could sit there and sort of create a little more flexibility going into this year. I could see John Merrill getting traded or being sent to the minors out of camp to free up some cap space. They could bury pretty much 1.1 million of that contract, I believe. And so that's one thing I can see them do. I mean, if it were me at the draft, I don't want to see him traded because I absolutely love the guy. But I would, to me, the only guy that was tradable that would have created a little cap space is Marcus Foligno. I think that he would have had a lot of value at the draft as well because of the brand of hockey and how respected he is in the game. But the reason why he wasn't traded is that Billy Guerin values him too much on this team. And not only that, I think he wants to give him an extension at some point, whether it's now or in the next, going into the season before next year's trade deadline when he would be a potential free agent. There's no easy answers right now. They are just, unfortunately, the pandemic really affected the business of the game, and the cap just hasn't risen to the levels that anybody thought. And so $1 million was all the cap went up, and the Wild are definitely going to have a complicated season because of that.
Yeah, and it's really hard with the buyout. Obviously, with the Parisian Suter and all that. I think it's going to be one of those where those role players that are the cheap, maybe if it's Rossi that steps up, he hasn't done what we think, but maybe if those players step up a lot and we can see, helping out Kaprizov, that'd be big. But I think it's going to be one of these years where it's a first round exit, maybe, or not too far.
Yeah, that's pretty much every year here. Yeah, I think like, and that would be my biggest concern going into the season is that, like, there a lot of teams just got better, right? I mean, Colorado goes out and gets Ryan Johansson. Chicago goes out and gets Connor Bedard and Taylor Hall and Nick Foligno and Corey Perry. Winnipeg up there going out and got Gabe Vilardi and Alex Iafallo. Nashville goes out and gets Ryan O'Reilly and Luke Shen and Gus Nyquist. Dallas goes and gets who'd they get? They went and got Matt Duchene. Arizona goes out and gets Zucker and Bukestad. And here the Wild just haven't done much. And I just think it's the line is so tight that it's so easy to take a step back and other teams jump step up. So it would not shock me if this year is a tough year for the Wild to make the playoffs. I don't think it's going to go, super, super easy like it did last year. But, remember I said that because I could be eating my words too. Though this team always seems to figure out a way.
Yeah, and speaking on kind of what we were talking about, I know the cap's most of the problem, but what would you say is another cause for the Wild, being first round exits the last couple of years?
Well, I mean, last year, I think a big reason was obviously Eriksson Ek's injury, and then also that Ryan Hartman was playing hurt. The Wild, just because of that cap situation, doesn't have a ton of depth where they could afford major injuries like that, especially at center where they're weak already. So I think that's probably one big reason. And the other thing is, like, not only Eriksson Ek, but if Kaprizov had just scored a couple goals that series, it could have been quite different, but he just got dried up. I don't think he was, it's not that he was hurt from the injury that he had against Winnipeg, but I don't think he ever got back into a rhythm because he missed so much time. So I think that's part of the issue as well. They've got, a lot of it is going to be biding time until these next 2 years are over. And then once those major cap hits are up and the cap continues to rise, I do think that Bill Guerin's plan is to pounce and be aggressive and try to acquire players.
Yeah, I think it doesn't help that, like, we had the year where Fiala was there, which was really helping Kaprizov, kind of giving the load off there. He didn't really have those players, obviously, like you were saying, Ek was out, so that didn't help. But it's just like Kaprizov can only do so much, and we need those other players to step up. You see Vegas having role players step up. I think role players are, for me at least, I think they're a huge part in a Stanley Cup.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Vegas, their third and fourth lines were as good as it gets. Their blue line is tremendous, but not only from its first pair, but right down to its third pair. And then their goaltending turned out to be more than adequate. Where I think a lot of people probably doubted that from Adin Hill. So their fourth line was just tremendous, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see where Vegas goes from here as well, because they just look like their window is wide open for many years.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see because, at least for me, I wasn't big on Aiden Hill going into the series.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone was. But he finally got that big contract, so good for him. But he really stand out, and we got Gustafson as well, who's playing really well. I think that if we keep adding these key, factors in this team, I think it could really make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see what happens with Gus. He filed for arbitration today. He wants to get paid, understandably so. Again, a lot, as you mentioned before, is going to depend on guys like Brock Faber and Marco Rossi to make an impact this year. And then we'll see what happens, if Adam Beckman and Sammy Walker get a shot, or Vinny Lettieri or something like that. So a lot of it again is like, I hate to be a broken record and make people think that they got to wait 2 years before this team can be a true contender. But a lot of it is not only just waiting for that, the cap hit to extinguish, but then a lot of these prospects to come over, the Huznadinovs and the Yurovs and the Ogrins and the Hunter Hates and the Damon Hunts and all those type of players. And then once those guys get here and they start to really grow together, then I think that this team will then be able to take the next step in its plan.
For sure. And then I got another question, and I was wondering if you had this. Um, could you really tell us what happened with Kaprizov in Russia back when that was happening?
Well, I mean, the big thing was that, I do think all the stories about him having a fake military card, I think that was all BS. But I can tell you that the big reason why he couldn't get back here was because he didn't have this P1. And so the way that it works is that when you're a European and you come over, not only do you have to get a US work visa, but then you have to get a secondary visa. But to do that, you have to get that done in Canada. Well, you could get that in any really U.S. embassy or consulate, but really, obviously, if you're in the United States, you're going to go up to Canada, and the places to go for that are really Ottawa and Calgary. But the problem is that during the pandemic, they shut down the offices. They made it extremely hard to get appointments. So the league had an exception last year where these Europeans were able to get into our country, and then on like essentially a handshake agreement. At some point, you're going to go to Canada and go get your secondary work visa. Well, the problem is that the Wild, when they had their appointment made for Kaprizov in December, that game, if you remember, got canceled because of the pandemic. So then what happens? He just never got up there. And then when the season ended, he's just like, well, I'll go home and deal with this later. The problem is that when he got to Dubai to come back over to the United States, the airlines wanted to see that secondary visa and he didn't have it. And so they sent him back to Russia. So the Wild essentially used some really heavy hitter diplomats that they knew from Washington, D.C. They got him over to Turkey and Istanbul. He essentially stayed in Istanbul for 2 or 3 weeks, and they worked on that, the paperwork there, and he was able to get back here. But because of that whole song and dance to try to get him back last summer, he has decided to stay in the United States all summer long and not go back to his homeland right now. So that is, I feel bad for the kid too. His mom, his brother, his parent, his dad, his grandparents all live in Russia. And right now, as far as I know, he cannot get back there, but he's decided to stay here this summer. And I think he's got a place down in Florida as well that he's probably checking out, during the summertime as well.
Yeah, the Wild got to be pretty happy with that. Try
Yep.
not to deal with something like that again, but
Yeah, I don't think that anybody was comfortable with that whole situation. Not only that, they were worried about the guy. They didn't know what was going on, what was real, what was not. Obviously, they were worried that he was going to get thrown in jail because of this manufactured thing with his military card, which just seemed to be baloney. But they got him back here, and he's safe and sound so far.
hmm what was the postseason question for Garen like? Was it uncomfortable or kind of weird situation for you?
Oh, when he and I got into it a bit.
Yep.
No, you know what? It really wasn't. I mean, that's just part of the job. Like, I know that Billy and I were going to be fine right after that. In fact, right after that, he invited me up to his office and we sat for an hour and talked. That's just a relationship that sometimes you have. This job gets contentious at times when you're constantly asking a GM a question, you piss him off. And that one, I knew the reason why that one blew up a little bit is that I knew that in those 2 days after the season, before that press conference, that his temperature was high. I thought that he was trying to lighten it for the fans and lighten it for the media when I knew deep down he was pissed off. And so that was my only real reason for kind of going after him, is that like at some point the fans need to see a next step, a get over the hump, which was the line that really threw him over the edge. But to me, it wasn't nearly as contentious as people made it out. But I think what happens is that because that stuff normally doesn't happen like in front of like live on KFan and in front of a live mic on online, fans take it as more than it really is. When that stuff does happen, but sometimes it happens on the phone, sometimes it happens face to face with no cameras around. That's just part of the job. When you ask as many questions as I do, and you're around the team as much as I am, eventually you're gonna piss them off. And on that one, we just had a little back and forth. I didn't think it was a big deal. Fans obviously did because they're not used to hearing that. But trust me, we were fine right after it. And that's just, again, part of the job that you have to deal with. And at times, that's part of being a sports writer too, is that you can't cower. You got to be, I have a certain belief and opinion about the way that I think the team should be. He has his own. There's certain things that he has to keep inside that he doesn't want to let out. And so that was just one of those moments where it just was, 10 years from now, we'll both look back on it and find it funny. We both find it funny now. Like, there was not one part of him when he got off that dais that was pissed off with me. I wasn't pissed at him. And that just, it was just not one of those things that's normally seen by the fans.
Yeah, I remember when I was watching it, I think I watched on YouTube the time after or something, and I saw that happen. It's just like, kind of jump out of your seat because you're not used to seeing that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I thought that
And
was,
that's probably why Billy and I get along so well, is that he gets intense, I get some intense. I've covered the team 18 years, so I want just for the fans, for them to see a long playoff run. This market deserves it. This organization deserves it. This owner deserves it. And as I said, the fans deserve it. And so that's my only point, is that, you can't just every year, have the same ending and just accept it. You have to eventually make steps. But to his point, the reality is that they do have one hand tied behind their back, with these buyouts. Now, a lot of fans don't give him, they don't give him much, what's the word I'm looking for, sympathy for that, because in their mind, he created the mess by buying out Parise and Suter. But the reality is, well, what fans do forget is that if Parise and Suter were here, they'd actually be making more money than the dead cap money. And the Wild, yes, they'd have two players for that money, but they'd have two aging players that aren't the same players anymore. So he just wanted to cut the cord, create a culture change. I know that it was a bold move by buying out both, but it worked out for Suter. He's gone to Dallas, made a second contract where he's making $4 a year and playing well down there for the most part. He played really well against the Wild in the playoffs, and Zach Parise will always be very popular in these parts, and obviously had a really good year with the Islanders last year, scoring I think 21 goals.
yeah, and it was, speaking of that, the draft back in 2003 in Nashville, that was that class of Parise, Suter, Fleury.
Yep.
And yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, it sucks, as a fan, because, we obviously want to go super far and win a cup, and we don't know everything that's going on behind that you do and Garen. So I think for us to react like that, we're just trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, no doubt. And that's what, like, there are some people that just hate the media in today's day and age. And and the fans that come at me and sometimes say that, I try to point out that, like, my job, the only reason to ask questions is to inform the fans. That's why I do so many podcasts with Bill Guerin, and why I write so much and talk so much on the radio and things like that, is that, like, I feel part of the job. That's my only reason for having a job, is to tell fans what's going on. And so that was just one of those moments that was just caught on the air, open mic night.
For sure, yeah. But yeah, it's good that you guys figured it out after. Didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. Same thing. Like, years ago, I don't know if you'll remember this because you would have been much younger, but when the Wild played, it would have been 2017 maybe. The Wild played the Blues in the first round of the playoffs, and trying to think when that would have been. It might have been 2016. 2016.
Yeah, I was at the one home game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it was 2016. It was Bruce Boudreau's first year, and the Wild were down 3-0 in the series against the Blues. And Bruce and I got into a bit back and forth during the thing that pissed him off so much he actually stormed off the dais. And same thing, though. Like, to me, I've had much more turbulent conversations with people. And so when I went upstairs and I wrote my story for the Scrib that night, I was working for the Star Tribune at the time. I wrote my story. There was not one part of me that worried about this. And then I happened to look at Twitter right after the game, and it was like the biggest story in hockey, that he and I got into this fight. And it was such a big thing on social media that the next morning at practice, I went up to Bruce and I said, "Hey, you're not good." And he's like, "Yeah, why would we be good?" Like, and again, even in his mind, he thought it was no big deal. So, that's just, it's part of the job. Like if you're going to do this job right and well and be around all the time, you're going to get into it with players and managers and coaches. And again, usually it's just not where people can see it. But trust me, on an everyday basis, I am putting out some fire. It's just something that's happened that's just created some sort of upheaval that takes getting used to and dealing with. So, like I said, usually it's much more contentious when it's not in the public eye.
Yeah, and I mean, you got a lot of followers on Twitter and all over your platform, so you want to keep that level of fire because you don't want to start to lose fans and stuff like that. So it's definitely understandable.
Yeah, but I mean that's not the reason to do it. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, but obviously it's not even losing fans. Like to me, it's just trying to let the fans know and try to ask the questions that fans can ask. Unfortunately, that's just the job is that you as Isaiah probably can't come to a press conference and ask those questions, but you might be wondering it. So it's
Yeah,
my job to ask those questions, and sometimes it pisses people off.
for sure. So, this is kind of based on you. Which awards and accolades stand out to you the most?
What awards? Um, I don't even know. I mean, actually, I'm staring. I've up on my thing. I have a couple. I turn my camera, but I can't. A couple of like National Sports Writer Awards that looks like I think I have like four up there. So that was pretty cool going on to the NSMA. It's National Sports Writers and Sportscasters Association in North Carolina. I've won four of those. The best, probably the one that means a lot to me is the Red Fisher Award. Red Fisher was a long time Montreal Canadiens sports writer, 50 years, covered everything with the Canadiens. He was like a legend in our business. And the year that I won the first ever Red Fisher Award, he actually passed away soon after that. And so that was really touching because I had the most amazing respect for that man. I remember first meeting him and being so nervous, and he treated me so well. So that was probably, and the reason why that one means a lot is that my colleagues voted for me. That one is, it's basically written, it's basically an award for what's considered the best beat writer in the NHL, and the fact that my actual colleagues around uh, the hockey world voted that for me, that meant a ton.
Yeah, it's gotta mean a lot for, people to actually notice what you're doing and the hard work you're putting in. I bet that's gotta be amazing.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny because like I used to be the young sports writer. Now I'm like the you know, like at the Athletic we have 40 hockey writers, and I'm like sort of the. I used to say that I was the father of the Athletic, like hockey writers. Now I've become like the grandfather. It feels
Hmm.
like, but that's kind of cool. It's like young sports writers that are even at our place that don't have a lot of experience. They come to me and they ask a lot of advice, and that means a ton. That they look at me as somebody like who to go talk to when they need some advice on how to do the job and do the job well, or how to deal with a certain situation or break a certain story or things like that. And that means a ton because the one thing I remember when I was a young sports writer, I was so nervous about doing anything, like even little things like booking travel, booking hotels, booking plane tickets, getting into an arena for the first time. Like if you are walking to XL Energy Center as a young sports writer and you've never been inside, it is intimidating on where do I go? How do I get in? Where do I go to get downstairs? How do I get to the press box? How do I file my story? How do I get to the locker rooms? And so but when I was a young sports writer, David J. Neal from the Miami Herald and Brian McGahan from the Palm Beach Post, they were my quote competition, but they treated me like an equal, and they would help me and help me and help me and help me. And so like those are one of the things that I just remember how much tougher my job could have been as a young 21-year-old, not being intimidated by everything, and what it would have been like if those two were really hard on me. And or didn't help me. And so I always try to remember that, where even if they're not somebody that works for the Athletic, I try to help them in many different ways. And so that's what I've kind of become later in my career. It's the same thing too with why I do these type of podcasts as well, because I remember I was 17 once and I was in this business, and I remember what it meant to me to have a veteran sports writer that I had respect for to actually talk to me and give me advice, or have that conversation. So I do my best. I'm not always the easiest person at times to get in touch with, just because the one thing with my direct messages is I do try to not look at them as much, just because some of the social media hate that you get at times, especially in Instagram where anybody can message you and then you have to
Yep.
request and all that. So, but I do try my best to, especially in the off season, have those conversations if I see that somebody, really has an interest in getting this business, and it's very gratifying. I told this story on Twitter the other day. I went to Whitehead High School like 4 or 5 years ago to talk to a communications class, and there was this kid there named Sam Sklar, and I stayed in touch with him, and he went to Michigan State, became a sports editor of the Michigan State newspaper, and now coincidentally he's on my old beat at my old newspaper as an intern, and I didn't even help him get the job. But so it just, those are the gratifying things of like, here's somebody that I helped mentor, and now they're not only in the business, but they're actually genuinely following in my footsteps because, he's covering a team right now that I have a lot of appreciation for a newspaper that I absolutely love, that I feel like I created that beat there. And so it's pretty neat to see him doing it.
Yeah, I think if you help others, I think it benefits both of you because, you may learn something from them and they're going to learn
Absolutely.
a lot from you. So
Yeah.
I think it's just better for everyone if you
Yeah.
work
Yeah.
together.
See, if I knew you before today, I would have known who Coach Chippy was.
Yeah.
Like I said his name and you knew it right away. So,
Hmm.
so like that's another reason why I should actually start to, pay attention to a little more to younger people.
For sure. Yeah. And then just before we go here, I wanted to ask, because you brought it up, what is the hardest arena to navigate in the NHL?
Well, it used to be the Igloo in Pittsburgh. It was an absolute maze of stairwells and all sorts of stuff. I actually once, a funny story, I was coming down the stairs and I somehow accidentally walked into the Penguins locker room. Like in the middle of a game, by the way, like in the intermission. And there was like, I walk in there and there was like Jaromir Jagr right in front of me. I was like, oh, sorry. It was hilarious. Toughest arena to navigate. That's a hard one. I have to give that more thought. It's funny, if I had the list in front of me, I could go through every arena and give it to you. Madison Square
Yeah.
Garden is pretty difficult because Madison Square Garden, it's weird. Like you actually are like the arena goes up, so you go in the ground floor, and the arena kind of works its way up. So like
Hmm.
the fifth floor is the event level and stuff like that.
Yep.
That's probably a tough one. The new buildings are always a little harder, like trying to figure out. Like Detroit's one arena, I just can the new arena in Detroit. Every time I'm there, I can't figure out where the hell I am. That's a tough one. I find XL to be the easiest.
Yeah.
It's and it's such a great place to watch a game as well.
Yeah. I love the atmosphere there. Go there a couple times during the season. So yeah, I think the Wild do a good job of that. So
Yes.
other than that, though, I want to thank you for coming on. I really
Yeah.
appreciate it. For taking the time, and good luck and enjoy that trip there in Italy.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it, Isaiah. And yeah, anytime you need anything, just let me know.
Sounds good. Have a good
Cool.
one.
Yep. See ya. Take care,
Yep.
buddy.
You too.